much, Robert. Robert invited me here. Robert is the director of CASAR, which is the Center for American Studies and Research. And Robert is an amazing playwright, if you don't know that, and he's also a very good friend, and went to Yale, so we have a Yale connection. I want to thank Iman Nouahed, who's the Faculty of Health Sciences chair, and I want to thank Lydia Wick and the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, all good friends. I had one of the best years of my life. In fact, the entire family had one of the best years of our life in Beirut at AUB in 2003. I've been taking lots of photos because everyone back home wants a trip down memory lane. And I still firmly believe that AUB is the world's most beautiful campus. I think it is very highly regarded as the Middle East region's best university, and it is located in the Middle East's most cosmopolitan city. So I know it's great to be in Beirut with all of you. This is going to be a grim talk. It's not on a good subject, and it's actually something that many of you will know sort of intuitively, the things that I'm going to say. But if I were to give this talk in other audiences in America or Europe, I think people would find it very difficult to understand that this could be true. So we're going to be talking today, I'm going to be talking today about America's participation in wars in the Middle East, and then the plight or the situation of refugees, especially those that America has displaced. And so I want to begin with this argument, namely that America has failed in its moral duty to assist those whose lives it has destroyed through its own wars in the Middle East. I want to show you how American wars have had a shattering effect, not only for those who have stayed in their home countries, but also for those who have fled. In America, very few people connect wars in the Middle East or the current refugee crisis to US military intervention. In the US, memories of war have faded and the refugee crisis seems far, far away. And I can tell you, I taught culture and politics in the contemporary Middle East last semester with some very sharp Yale students, and they had no idea that the US is still at war any place in the Middle East. They have no idea. So the goal of my talk today is to rekindle this moribund history of American war in the Middle East and to document, some of the damage it has produced. I'm a medical anthropologist, and so I want to focus specifically on the health costs of US military intervention and the subsequent vulnerability of Middle Eastern refugees who have made their way to the US in the aftermath of war. Sadly, no other region of the world has suffered so much war, turmoil, and population disruption due to protracted conflict than the Middle East. 15 of 22 Arab League nations, comprising 85% of the region's overall population, had already suffered from complex emergencies before the fateful 2011 Arab uprisings. Conflicts dating back to the end of World War II can be traced to 5 critical forces. And as you all know, first was the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, which has resulted in a protracted conflict between Israel and Palestine, as well as the series of wars between Israel and neighboring Arab nations, obviously including Lebanon. The second cause was colonial independence movements, especially against the French in North Africa, which led to some very bloody wars of independence, most notably in Algeria. Third were sectarian-inflected conflicts, such as Lebanon's 15-year civil war, the 8-year Iran-Iraq war launched by Saddam Hussein and his secular Ba'ath regime against the Shia theocracy that came into power in Iran exactly 40 years ago. And I have to tell you, in Yale and many universities in the US, there's been a sort of discussion right now of the 40th anniversary of the Iran Revolution. It's been 40 years this year. Then a fourth factor relating to that was the rise of Islamist movements in the region, which have led to wars between the more secular and Islamist forces in countries ranging from Algeria to Sudan. And then finally, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union has played out in the Middle East in ways that continue to haunt the region today. US involvement in Afghanistan dates back exactly 40 years to 1978-79, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the United States retaliated by supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, the radical Sunni Islamist fighting force. In effect, through the Mujahideen, the US engaged in a proxy war with the Soviet Union. The withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1989 represented a Cold War victory for the US, but this did not result in greater stability, prosperity, or freedom from conflict for the Afghan people. Indeed, our former allies, the Mujahideen, became the precursor to other radical Sunni insurgent groups in the region, including Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and eventually the Islamic State, or ISIS. Now, in 2001, responding to the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and driven by a determination to eliminate Middle Eastern terrorism, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, its military campaign in Afghanistan. Then, less than 2 years later, in 2003, the US launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, which we now know was based on false intelligence regarding Saddam Hussein's links to September 11th and his threats to US national security through weapons of mass destruction. Which brings us to the present moment. The US is still at war in Afghanistan. At 18 years, it is the longest war in modern US history and one that some analysts describe as permanent. And although an end to the Iraq War has been declared twice, first by President George W. Bush in his Mission Accomplished speech on May 1st, 2003, and then on December 19th, 2011, by then President Barack Obama, the truth is that more than 5,000 US troops remain on the ground in Iraq, nearly 16 years after the US invaded. And in the single year of 2016, in sort of the moment of ISIS engagement in Iraq, the US dropped a total of 12,095 bombs on Iraq in this battle against ISIS. In Syria, we never think of the US as being very involved in Syria, but in Syria, in the same year, that number was even higher at 12,192 bombs dropped. And as in Iraq, more than 5,000 US troops remain on the ground, despite President Trump's recent decision to withdraw them. Together, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria make up the world's 3 most fatal wars, with annual civilian casualties exceeding the 10,000 mark in both Iraq and Syria for many years in a row. And in Afghanistan, the UN reported a record number of civilian deaths last year in 2018, and a total death toll of nearly 40,000 people, both civilians and combatants. So indeed, the inconvenient truth, but one that few Americans seem to ponder these days, is that the United States has done more to produce and sustain wars in the Middle East than to relieve them. Today, the US is deeply engaged, at least from the air, in all 5 current Middle Eastern wars. This includes the ones it started in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the 3 wars that have emerged in the wake of the failed 2011 Arab uprisings, including in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. With the exception of Libya, all of these Middle Eastern wars have made the 2019 10 Conflicts to Watch list, which is put out annually by the International Crisis Group. And just to give you a sense of their rating, what they consider to be from the worst to sort of the least worst of the 10. So number 1 on the list is Yemen. After more than 4 years of war led by a Saudi UAE coalition, almost 16 million Yemenis, or half the population, are on the brink of starvation, facing what the UN calls severe acute food insecurity. Yemen is now considered to be in the midst of the world's worst current humanitarian crisis. The US has supported the Saudi UAE coalition from the air and on the ground, where it regularly refuels coalition jets. Number 2 on the list is Afghanistan, the country that currently suffers from the deadliest fighting. By all accounts, the US-led war in Afghanistan is intensifying, with the Taliban either gaining control of or contesting more territory than at any time since 2001. About half of Afghanistan is under Taliban control, and a sharp uptick in US airstrikes has not curbed their momentum. Thus, the permanent US war in Afghanistan is entering a deadly new phase, with no end in sight and with 14,000 US troops still on the ground. The war in Syria, which has affected Lebanon so much, has dropped to number 5 on the Conflicts to Watch list. However, despite optimism that the Syrian civil war would end with the routing of ISIS, large swaths of the country remain battlegrounds, and Trump's decision in December to supposedly withdraw US troops from the country may increase the odds of a bloody conflict involving Turkey, the Kurds, and the Assad regime. This, in turn, may reignite ISIS, which, as you may know, the US troops are currently right now attempting to obliterate ISIS in eastern Syria in a very heavy bombing and artillery campaign. Okay, well, Libya was on the list last year in 2018, and it dropped off the list this year in 2019. But it is important to note that the EU has doubled its French-led G5 Sahel force, which has been fighting jihadists in the Sahel region of North Africa following the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in 2011. In Libya, a deadly war between local Libyan tribal factions, militias, and jihadists has intensified regional instabilities in other parts of the Sahel region, including Mali and Chad. Again, the US is involved from the air, backing Libyan forces in their bombing campaigns against jihadist targets. And so, as a result of these many wars in which the US is deeply involved and implicated, the Middle East now has the largest number and percentage of forcibly displaced persons of any region in the world. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reports that 68.5 million people in the world are now forcibly displaced, the majority of them from Syria and Afghanistan. And it's thought that 13 million Syrians, almost 9 million Iraqis, and about 4 million Afghans are also in need of humanitarian assistance. However, today, the Syrian refugee crisis is most acute, with 5.6 million Syrians living as refugees, including about 1.5 million in Lebanon. Although the Syrian civil war has made the headlines, I think, the most in recent years and has led to the world's worst refugee crisis, and the US-led war in Afghanistan is currently the world's deadliest war, the country of Iraq has received comparatively less attention, even though millions of Iraqis, too, have been killed or forced to flee their country. Iraq is still living through nearly 40 years of perpetual war and suffering. Saddam Hussein came to power in 1979, and soon thereafter he plunged his country into a crippling 8-year war with neighboring Iran. The Iran-Iraq War led to the death of as many as 1 million soldiers and civilians. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded another neighboring country, Kuwait, which led to the US's first Gulf War in Iraq, as well as 13 years of UN-imposed sanctions. In 1996, an oil for food program was put in place by the UN to prevent mass starvation in the country, but the sanctions continued to cripple the Iraqi economy until they were removed at the start of the second US war in Iraq in 2003. Now, in retrospect, the second US war in Iraq is widely condemned by political scientists as a US military and foreign policy failure of massive proportions, perhaps the worst in modern US and Middle East history. The US military intervention in Iraq increased political instability in the country, leading to a power vacuum that was partly filled by Islamic terrorist organizations, most notably ISIS. And furthermore, the US invasion of Iraq served as a crucial tipping point in an unstable sectarian balance of power, unleashing deep-seated sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslim factions in the country, with consequences that have been truly profound not only for Iraq, but for the increasing sectarian divisions that are devastating the region as a whole. But how has the ceaseless violence impacted the Iraqi people? I'm going to argue that the costs of war in Iraq have been acute, and they include physical suffering, demographic and reproductive health consequences, mental health disorders, and high costs to the economy, the infrastructure, and the environment. However, here today, I go through all of them in my book, but here today I want to focus on 3 of the most pernicious costs of war in Iraq, namely the body count, or the number of Iraqi dead, depleted uranium, or DU, a radioactive toxin, and the Iraqi refugee crisis. So to begin with the body count. The most important impact of war in Iraq has been the very high death toll. The Iraqi body count, or the number of war-related casualties, has been and continues to be a highly controversial subject. On the one hand, no one can say precisely how many Iraqis have been killed because estimates vary greatly and the accuracy of information coming out of Iraq is uncertain. However, another problem surrounds the US military's total refusal to engage in Iraqi death toll estimates. Early on, this guy, US General Tommy Franks, who led the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and then the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, he famously stated, "We don't do body counts." As a result of US coalition indifference to the Iraqi death toll, a number of academic research groups and human rights organizations began tallying estimates of wartime casualties in Iraq. And perhaps the best estimates come from an international monitoring project called the Iraq Body Count, or IBC, which has updated and cross-checked reports of death ever since the beginning of the 2003 US invasion. IBC reports that approximately 250,000 deaths have occurred in Iraq due to direct war-related violence among both civilians and combatants. And of these, more than half of these deaths are of Iraqi civilians. By 2015, in the midst of the ISIS siege, IBC was calling the massive death toll in Iraq a catastrophic normal. And in 2015, the annual death rates were at least 10,000, and they continued for 2015, 2016, 2017. Now, compared to the 4,500 cumulative deaths of US military personnel in Iraq, the Iraq body count is at least 55 to 110 times higher than that of American casualties, depending on which death toll estimate is used. So put another way, the US started a war in Iraq that has been deadly for American soldiers, but truly deadly for Iraqis whose death toll continues to mount. Of all of the destruction set in motion by the US invasion of Iraq, the one with the longest term health consequences may have to do with contamination of the environment. Both the first and second Gulf Wars in Iraq left a toxic residue called depleted uranium, or DU, which is the waste product of the uranium enrichment process and is about 60% more radioactive than natural uranium. Like lead, nickel, and other heavy metals, DU is chemically toxic to humans. DU has been used since 1959 in the US munitions industry because it is 65% denser than lead, it has a high melting point, it has a tensile strength comparable to most steels, and it ignites when it fragments. The US military has called DU the silver bullet for destroying enemy tanks, and DU is also called the silver shield to armor US tanks against incoming enemy fire. However, when DU explodes, it creates, and I'm going to quote, a fine respirable sized dust that contaminates an impact site and presents a hazard to combat troops and civilians, unquote. This DU dust in the environment has a radioactive decay chain lasting 4.5 billion years, thereby posing very long-term health risks to exposed populations. Now, DU first emerged as a social, political, and scientific issue during the First Gulf War. It is estimated that in that war, that was a short war, about 6 weeks, that nearly 900,000 DU rounds were fired in the First Gulf War by US and British troops, and that about 80% of them missed their marks and just got deposited in the environment. And then soon thereafter, Gulf War veterans began complaining about a problem called Gulf War syndrome, a cluster of health problems including, among other things, both reproductive and sexual health problems among Gulf War vets. And there's a wonderful book by Susie Kilshaw called Impotent Warriors about British Gulf War veterans and the problems that they suffer. Well, it didn't stop after the First Gulf War. With the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the use of DU continued. And then the World Health Organization was sort of forced to release a report entitled Potential Impact of Conflict on Health in Iraq, which did suggest that DU might be related to reports of increased cancers, birth defects, reproductive health problems, and renal diseases in the Iraqi population. Since then, a series of studies have been carried out in the heavily bombarded city of Fallujah, which sustained some of the worst damage by US forces. And I have to say, these studies are especially coming out of the University of Michigan School of Public Health, where I used to be affiliated. So about a decade on, these epidemiological studies show high rates of congenital malformations, about 15% of all births in Fallujah, higher than expected rates of cancer, especially blood cancers, leukemia, and lymphoma, including among children, higher than expected rates of infant death when compared to infant mortality rates across the region, and an anomalous sex ratio in children under age 5, suggesting that genetic damage was sustained in the 0 to age 4 cohort. Hair samples taken from the parents of children with congenital anomalies in Fallujah show the statistically significant presence of DU in their mothers' bodies. And I'm not going to show you images, they're horrific, but if you did look up Fallujah babies on the internet, you would see Iraqi neonates with grotesque malformations, very shocking, very heartbreaking, which some DU activists are attempting to link to the DU, that was heavily deposited in this particular environment. Now, as with the body count issue, the human and environmental toxicity linked to DU is an issue still mired in controversy. However, DU activists have accused the U.S. Department of Defense of gross negligence in using a weapon in Iraq, and I quote, that distributes large quantities of toxic waste in areas where people live, work, grow food, or draw water, unquote. And so, as an Iraqi refugee named Kamal told me, and I met him in Michigan after he had received asylum, this is what he said. "We heard that there is uranium everywhere. You know, Marcia? Cancer. A lot of people in Iraq got cancer. If you ask anybody here in America, you got the flu, the question there would be, you got cancer? Before, it was not easy to use the term saratan, or cancer, but now it's easy to say, I got cancer. My sister, she had a 16-year-old daughter. She died after 2 months from cancer, liver cancer. She found out and then she died. And as I was to learn from Kamal, he had been conscripted in Saddam's army as a telecommunications specialist. I was in a tank, always in a tank, he said. I saw everything, the smells, the dead people. Sometimes we were sleeping with people who were dead in the tanks, injured people with blood all around. We saw everything. So when we see that someone is dead, we don't even care. We saw so many dead people, so much blood. Sometimes we had to eat with people who were dead beside us. Eventually, Kamal joined the Iraqi resistance and made his way out of the country. By the time I met him in Detroit, Michigan, Kamal had a happy story to tell. In the 10 years since he had arrived in America, he was able to accomplish many of the things in life that other Iraqi refugees could only hope for. This included a happy marriage to his Iraqi sweetheart, who he had met in a refugee camp, American citizenship by way of naturalization, an economically stable life as the proprietor of 2 small barbershops, ownership of 2 fixer-upper homes that he and his 2 Iraqi refugee brothers remodeled, and the joys of parenthood through the birth of a baby. Pulling a photo from his wallet, Kamal smiled widely when he showed me the pictures of little Haider, his 13-month-old son. As he pointed out proudly, Haider was an American citizen by birth, not born in exile, in a land that they now called home. So I want to talk about the Iraqi refugee crisis. It's the stories of Iraqi men like Kamal that I've shared in this recent book, which is here, America's Arab Refugees. But I want to tell you, of all of the stories that I collected, Kamal's is the most atypical because it's happy. It has a happy and successful ending. Most of the other Iraqi refugees with whom I worked were not so lucky. Over a period of 5 years, I conducted ethnographic field work with about 100 resettled Arab refugees in metropolitan Detroit, Michigan, which you probably know because of the huge Lebanese diaspora there, is home to the largest Arab ethnic enclave community in North America. And I want to say the sort of succession of people fleeing over the past 50 years, this Detroit metro area has really been North America's largest receiving grounds for people fleeing from conflict in this region. Beginning in the 1950s, exiled Palestinians started resettling in the Detroit suburbs, and this was a pattern that continued among Palestinians over the 5 ensuing decades. By the 1970s, Palestinians were joined by Lebanese, whose numbers swelled with each passing year of the Lebanese Civil War, and I would say especially Lebanese from South Lebanon, from southern Lebanon. By the mid-1990s, Lebanese and Palestinians were joined by Iraqis, tens of thousands of whom came as refugees in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. So over a half century, between 1950 and 2000, metropolitan Detroit absorbed three major populations of fleeing Arabs: Palestinians, then Lebanese, then Iraqis. And so by the year 2000, a big book was published by Michigan scholars dubbed Arab Detroit, because it was really highlighting the importance of what they estimated to be about 1/4 to 500,000 people of Arab descent now living in this greater metropolitan Detroit area. However, then came 2008, which was the year of the Great Recession, and this is the same year that the Iraqi population of Arab Detroit began to swell as the second wave of Iraqi refugees began to receive admission into the US. And I want to just show you Iraqi admissions. You can look at it yourself, but look at, in 2007, the war was in full tilt, but it really took 5 years before Iraqis started to be received again into the US. And so there were almost 14,000 in 2008. The biggest year was in 2013, is that right? Oh no, 2014. And so just to sort of give you a sense of the numbers, by 2009, 1/4 of all refugees entering the US that year were Iraqis. Arab Detroit in 2009 absorbed as many Iraqis as the cities of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined. So they mostly went to Michigan. By 2014, Iraqis represented more than 1/4, 28% of all refugees entering the United States. They were the single largest group. So this decade, from 2007 to 2015, this decade saw the influx of 126,000 Iraqi refugees into the US. All refugees admitted to America, but less than 1/2 of the Iraqis who were seeking US refugee status. And where did they settle? As seen in this table, Iraqis are in virtually every US state. The only state that they are not in is Wyoming. And who is from Wyoming? Don't go there, because that's the state of Dick Cheney. Yeah. The movie Vice, he was the vice president during the George W. Bush era, and the only state that did not take refugees is Wyoming. I mean, it's pretty amazing. These are called tiers. The first tier states, there are 3 of them. California has got the most, followed by Michigan, followed by Texas. But other states have taken in between 1,000 and 10,000 Iraqis. Our tiny state of Connecticut, that some of us, Kaveh and I, Yale's located in Connecticut. It's a small state, but it's done its fair share to bring in Iraqis over the years. So Iraqis have been settled all over the US, including Alaska, Hawaii. But I want to argue here, the state of Michigan has taken in a disproportionate share of Iraqi refugees, and that the local Michigan economy is poorly suited for such large-scale Iraqi refugee resettlement, particularly the city of Detroit, where most of these refugees have been placed. And I want to talk to you about Detroit as a city, and to say it is America's poorest big city. Of cities over 200,000 people, it is the poorest. 38% of its population, about 2/5, live below the US federal poverty line. 2/3 of all Detroiters, so about 2/3, live in a state of what's called ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, though employed. These are people in America we would call the working poor. They have jobs, but they have no assets, And these poverty figures are replicated in Arab Detroit's refugee community. This is a shocking statistic. 82% of all Iraqi Muslim refugee families live on household incomes in America of less than $30,000 per year. That may sound like a lot, but that is a federal poverty line income for a family. One Yale graduate student gets a stipend of $30,000 US a year to live on, and these are whole families. And even worse, 42%, nearly half of all these Iraqi Muslim refugee families live well below the US federal poverty line on household incomes of less than $10,000 US per year. That is dire poverty. And so I want to show you what the map of Detroit looks like, what an African American, he was the president of the American Geography Association, his name was Harold Rose, would call a geography of despair. And so this is the city of Detroit, the metro area. In the center, which has got the sort of actual city of Detroit, that is Detroit. It is a poor African American city. The vast majority of Detroit proper is African American. This part is southwestern. This is Dearborn, which is the sort of part of Arab Detroit where a large refugee population is located, but there are refugees living in the center of Detroit in Hamtramck, a formerly Polish neighborhood. And they're now, because there's like so many Iraqis coming in, they're being settled all over on the margins of the city of Detroit, in Sterling Heights and other places. So this city is trying to absorb this huge influx of Iraqi refugees. And so you've got a black city, an Arab refugee fringe, and then around, especially along the lake and up there, does anybody know what those areas are? Urban, white affluence, areas, suburbs of incredible white privilege. And so you've got this sort of three sectors, a very, story of white flight out into the suburbs, and this sort of poor inner city, mostly black, and then this poor marginal population of struggling refugees. And I say they're literally and figuratively on the margins of this impoverished, deteriorating, mostly black city, which Harold Gross calls a geography of despair. And so I want to sort of talk theory a little bit, this notion of intersectionality of oppressions. So as a scholar, I was there for 5 years going back and forth from the college town of Ann Arbor into the sort of heart of Arab Detroit, trying to figure out what I was seeing. I was really deeply moved by what I was seeing because I was encountering a lot of really struggling people who had fled from the region, especially Iraqis. And since that time, there's sort of two strands of critical theory and activism that have really moved me, and with which I frame this discussion of Arab refugee lives in America. And so the first is the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a movement that was started in America online by young black activists in the wake of multiple incidents of racial profiling and police brutality, particularly toward young black men. However, since it began in the summer of 2015, that's when the movement kind of got going, the Black Lives Matter movement has really diversified, raising awareness about perceived injustices in a variety of social systems and among a variety of people of color and genders in the US. And I'm very impressed by and really grateful for the Black Lives Matter movement and its agenda to achieve greater social justice in America. And so as a scholar, the Black Lives Matter movement has motivated me to think about the profound struggles of another very oppressed minority group in America. I would say in general Arab Muslims, but I'm really going to say Arab Muslim refugees who've come to America in their darkest hour of need. And so in my book, because of its location in Detroit, I highlight the profiling of both black and Arab populations in the US and the widespread vilification of both black and Arab men as inherently violent and untrustworthy. And because of the location of the study in Detroit, Michigan, which as I said is a predominantly black city with a substantial Arab ethnic enclave, and it manifests poverty so deep and pernicious that the infrastructure of the city, the buildings are literally falling in on each other. It is really, honestly, reminiscent of a Middle Eastern war zone. And when I returned from Lebanon in 2003 with my family and we were going through the city of Detroit, my children were impressed by the fact that they lived in a country that was coming out of a war. And they said to me in their tender, ages of like 8 and 5, Mom, was there a war here too? Because inside Detroit, it looks like something happened, apocalyptic. And so, I want to sort of compare the sort of serious situation of Detroit as a city of blacks and Arabs living side by side, both of whom are facing this profound kind of intersectionality of oppressions. And so to turn to intersectionality theory has been very important in sort of American gender studies and academia in the last, I would say, 2 decades. It was really started by black feminist scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. Patricia Hill Collins has just published this new book on intersectionality, key concepts. Intersectionality theory tries to elucidate the relationships among multiple forms of oppression based on gender, race, and class. That's the sort of holy triumvirate, but also including sexual orientation, age, a person's ability, their religion or national origin. So rather than these forms of oppression acting independently, intersectionality really argues that systematic forms of oppression are interrelated, they're multiplicative in their effects. They, sort of combine together to lead, in many cases, to poor health outcomes, to profound discrimination, to premature mortality. So intersectionality theory has been applied in the US primarily to the lives of Black women, less so to the lives of Latino women in the United States. But I want to argue that this framework has great utility in understanding intersecting oppressions facing other minority populations. And if you looked at the case of Arab refugees, I would argue that intersecting oppressions include, but are not limited to, discrimination based on ethnicity, religion, social class, sometimes race, gender, and appearance, especially because women are most visible, especially if they're wearing the hijab. And so intersectionality as applied to Arab refugee lives in the United States really is, I think, very important for interrogating different axes of oppression and discrimination. And so thinking through what the Iraqi refugees in my study were facing, just to tell you sort of their situation, most of them were very precariously employed. They were often desperately poor. My interlocutors, I asked them about what they had suffered, and they told me about their war traumas, their deaths in the family, the various health problems and physical disabilities they were suffering from, separations from family members, their loneliness, poverty, and chronic stress. Many of the men didn't speak English fluently, and many of the women, their wives, didn't speak English at all. Few of them had attended school in the US. Few had gone beyond high school in their home countries. And without good English skills or advanced educations, most of the Iraqi refugee men in my study were only employable in very low-wage, blue-collar or service sector occupations. They were working at gas stations. They were dishwashers or busboys in Arab restaurants. Sometimes they worked construction. If they were lucky, they got a factory job. Their salaries and their wages were generally low. Most were living in very small apartments, and they were eking out subsistence lives, usually well below the poverty line. And without regular employment, most didn't have private health insurance. I was actually working in a period before Obamacare. So people who had medical problems, what were they going to do? Most did not own credit cards. They couldn't put the cost onto a credit card. So virtually all of their transactions financially, including their medical visits to clinics, were handled in cash. And in cases of medical emergency, social safety nets were generally missing, forcing some participants in my study to rely on local Islamic charities for relief. And so Iraqis said, our lives are hard, they're stressful. Most of the Iraqi men I worked with were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Most had endured hardships. They were political refugees. Some had gone through war. Some had been tortured. They had been persecuted in their home country. And so al-Harb, the war, figured prominently in men's narratives. And for Iraqis in particular, they feared that their health problems, including their reproductive health problems, were somehow related to war exposures and traumas. And so all of the participants in my study, I work on reproduction and assisted reproduction, and so I was really dealing with a group of people I would call reproductively vulnerable. They were facing persistent reproductive problems, often intractable infertility problems in an environment where they were really expected to become parents. Parenthood was kind of socially mandatory. And so going back to the case of Kamal, he was willing to tell me. He was very open, very talkative man, and he was willing to tell me that the birth of his own son, Haider, was exceptional because he suffered from a serious male infertility problem. And male infertility was common in the Iraqi refugee population in Arab Detroit, and probably had something to do with the consequences of exposure to reproductive toxins in the environment. And so this is what Kamal told me. Marcia, I want to tell you something about me. I have no problem with my body. I don't smoke, no drinking. I do exercise every day, and I'm healthy. But I know a lot of Iraqi men like me. They don't have kids, and they take a long time to get a baby. I know about 15 to 20 people like that here in Michigan. Some are friends of mine. We are all refugees. All of us Iraqi refugees. The same life we lived, the same war, the same camp, the same thing. And we began talking about the subject of not getting babies. And I always tell them, we don't want to be shy about this because we need a baby. Don't be shy. Go to the doctor. Don't stay at home. Tell him, the doctor, I'm sick and I need to take medicine. I know somebody with male infertility, and he was ready to make a divorce with his wife, and he's young. But I tell him, please don't do that. Go to the doctor. Do something. In Iraq, we lost all our good doctors. But here in America, everything is good. The doctor is good. Technology is good. Medicine is good. But some men, they're embarrassed to say, I have this problem. It's the rujula, the manhood, but this is wrong. And so, to talk about reproductive vulnerability, okay, virtually all of my Iraqi interlocutors, the men who were infertile, often severely infertile, they had no sperm or very low sperm count, they all required this thing called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. ICSI is a variant of in vitro fertilization, or IVF. But ICSI was designed especially to overcome male infertility problems. And so what it is, it's IVF, but instead of taking sperm that don't work, they don't swim, they're low in number, poor in movement, they basically take the sperm into a small micropipette and they inject it directly into the oocyte, kind of forcing fertilization to occur. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. And so ICSI really allows men who would otherwise never conceive a biogenetically related child, it allows some of them to have offspring. And this even includes men who are azospermic. They have no sperm in their ejaculate. They don't produce sperm in their ejaculate. And so they have to go into their testicles and they painfully biopsy them. They do fine needle biopsies or aspirations to try to get any kind of spermatozoa out of the testicles. It's a kind of genital torture, but men are willing to go through it. And so ICSI, I would argue, we call IVF the hope technology. It gives people hope. ICSI is the masculine hope technology. It gives infertile men hope that they can have a baby. And this is especially important for infertile Muslim men who are otherwise generally religiously prohibited from seeking alternative forms of fatherhood, either through sperm donation or child adoption. Yet, this is the problem for Iraqi refugee men. The US is the most expensive country in the world in which to make an ICSI baby. On average, a single cycle of ICSI costs more than $13,000 US. It's a sum that few of these impoverished Iraqi men could ever begin to afford. And so despite their desperate desires and their significant efforts to seek treatment, few of the Iraqi men in my study were viable candidates for ICSI. They were literally priced out of assisted reproduction altogether. And I want to say something that made me very mad. I am a fan of President Barack Obama in general, but he brought the Affordable Care Act to America, ACA, and it includes many things, but it includes no coverage for assisted conception, assisted reproductive technologies of any kind for anybody, including people like these, or including for African Americans who also have a need for IVF and ICSI. And it makes me especially upset because we now learn through Michelle Obama's recent memoir that she and Barack had infertility problems, and Malia and Sasha are IVF babies. And it's like, Barack, you allowed it for, you and Michelle used IVF, why not for everybody else? Why wasn't it covered through ACA, but it wasn't? So nobody in America, very few people in America are subsidized to do this, and it means that a lot of Americans can't do it. But for these people, I kept thinking of them as reproductive exiles, struggling, infertile reproductive exiles. Why? On the one hand, they were forced to leave their home country because of war and political violence caused by the US. But once they arrived in the US, they found themselves stranded, unable to return to Iraq because of the ongoing violence, but unable to access these infertility services due to their structural vulnerability within the US healthcare system. And so exile has two meanings for this population. First, the forced removal from one's home country with little hope of return. And second, the feeling of being forced out of the host country's inaccessible healthcare system, where this masculine hope technology of ICSI is a mirage. It's not going to happen for most of them. So the sense of reproductive exile, of being unable to access ICSI in the US, but being unable to return home to Iraq with this shattered healthcare system, really comes closest to representing these infertile Iraqi people's subjectivities. My term is not theirs. They don't say I'm in reproductive exile, but I believe they are in reproductive exile. But having said this, I want to say that most of the infertile Iraqi refugee men in my study were active seekers of reproductive health care. They often came alone without their partners to the local Arab-serving IVF clinic to consult with a male Lebanese IVF physician. And once there, these men were willing to subject their bodies to a variety of different things. They underwent repeated rounds of semen analysis. They were willing to do genetic testing. They were willing to take hormones. They were willing to go through these painful testicular biopsies and aspirations. And I want to call this male reproductive agency. It's rarely portrayed in studies of Arab guys, or really in anthropological studies of reproduction more generally. We act as if reproduction is something that women only do, that men are never involved. And as I've argued in my book, The New Arab Man, and in many articles, Arab Muslim men are often caring and concerned reproductive agents. This male reproductive agency entails a willingness to make reproductive decisions with their wives, to undertake reproductive surgeries to improve their fertility. In fact, in Lebanon, a lot of guys go through something called a varicocelectomy, a surgery to presumably improve their fertility. Men are willing to go through ICSI, and in some cases, they're willing to free their wives from childless marriages when male infertility is deemed hopeless. Such male reproductive agency entails love and sacrifice, care and concern, and sometimes heartbreaking compromises and sacrifices which men are willing to make for those they love. And Robin, how much time? I do have this sort of poignant story of a guy. We have time?
We're enjoying it, Marcia.
Okay, well this is a story, one that kind of got me the most. This man, who I'm going to call Sheikh Ali, he came specifically to meet me after reading my study ad that I had posted in an IVF clinic waiting area. And as I was soon to discover, Ali was a religiously trained Shia cleric. This tall, substantial man, standing well over 6 feet in his black suit and white dress shirt with a closely trimmed beard, was an imposing figure. Yet, as we sat together in a private space in the clinic, it became clear that Sheikh Ali was a broken man, whose life story was quite tragic. Sheikh Ali had been born in southern Iraq to a large family of 6 sons and 6 daughters. In the early years of Iraq's Ba'athist political regime, even poor Shia families from the south were able to educate their children under the social welfare system. So Ali and all of his brothers were sent to the University of Baghdad, where they earned master's degrees in engineering. However, before they attended university, Ali and his brothers had studied in a Shia madrasa in the holy city of Najaf, where Ali had learned to read and interpret the Quran. He graduated as a Shia cleric in 1985, 6 years before the first Gulf War. And the first Gulf War was an event that would change his life forever. When U.S. troops invaded Iraq at the end of 1990, the U.S. government armed both the Shia Muslims in southern Iraq and the Kurds in northern Iraq, encouraging them to rise up against the regime of Saddam Hussein. Sheikh Ali's religiously trained family members did not fight, but they were caught up in the post-war dragnet. Targeted by Saddam's regime for being religious Shia Muslims, Sheikh Ali and 2 of his brothers were sent to prison. The 2 brothers, both sheikhs, both engineers, and both young fathers of 2 children, were killed, news that made their elderly father go blind. Sheikh Ali survived his 3 years of imprisonment, but he was brutally beaten and tortured in a small, dark prison cell where he lived from 1991 to 1994. Upon his unexpected release, they didn't kill him, he fled to neighboring Syria, then to Lebanon, where the local Shia Muslim community took him in on a temporary basis. And soon thereafter, he was granted asylum in the US, and he was resettled as a refugee in the state of Arizona. In Arizona, Sheikh Ali met his wife Nadia, also a resettled Iraqi refugee. Sheikh Ali and Nadia loved each other and were physically passionate, sometimes making love 2 to 3 times a day, he told me. This was partly intended to conceive a child, which both of them ardently desired. However, Sheikh Ali was diagnosed as azoospermic, with no sperm whatsoever in his testicles. And he said, that day was very sad, very sad. The doctor explained, no, nothing, and I cried. Meanwhile, Sheikh Ali's wife Nadia was becoming desperate to have her own children, given the scrutiny of her childlessness in the growing Iraqi refugee community in Arizona. Although she loved her husband, she wanted children more, telling him, I need a baby. Eventually, she exercised her right to divorce within the American judicial system, leaving Sheikh Ali after 3 years of marriage. She remarried quickly, becoming the mother of 2 children. Out of love and compassion for her first husband, she continued to call Sheikh Ali, letting her young children speak to their uncle on the phone. To mend his broken heart, Sheikh Ali moved to the much larger Iraqi refugee community in Arab Detroit. There, he knew no one, but he found easy employment as a clerk in a Lebanese-owned gas station. In his job, he earned $500 a week, barely enough to cover his rent, his food, his car payments, and gasoline, and the $200 monthly remittance to his elderly disabled parents in Iraq. Ever since he fled Iraq, Sheikh Ali had not worked either as an engineer or a Muslim cleric, the two professions for which he was highly trained. And furthermore, Sheikh Ali told me, I need a wife. I need one now. And although this is in the book, I didn't include it in this talk, let me just put it this way. He asked me if I was married. He asked if I knew he asked if I knew any American women who were not married, were looking for somebody. He said, I don't care, American, Iraqi, Lebanese, I don't care. I need a wife and I need one now. And he told me many other things, some very intimate details. You know, he was a very frustrated man. And I actually did try to introduce him to a widowed woman that I knew, a Syrian woman who had several children, and she was also interested in remarrying. Her husband had passed away, but when I told him that he was a Shia cleric, and she was Sunni and she was Syrian, she just said, there's just no way. I just can't bring myself to do it. She just wouldn't meet him. She just said, there's too much of a gulf between us and it's not going to work. So I never was able to. And I know that she's still single. She never remarried, but I don't know what happened to him. But I do know, you know, we talked about like with Iraqi women, you know, he goes, no, they all need children. And the only Iraqi woman I could marry is one who already has children. But he was poor. He was a poor person. He didn't have money. He was azoospermic. He was completely infertile. And, you know, he really was a broken man. The Arabic word miskin, you know, somebody who was really unable to fulfill his most basic needs in life. Sheikh Ali was living in a situation of quiet desperation. And so there's a term that we're now using in medical anthropology called structural vulnerability. I think that on the conceptual level, this Arabic notion of the miskin really equates quite well with what Philippe Bourgois, a very famous medical anthropologist, and his colleagues are calling structural vulnerability, something that they're applying to vulnerable populations. And so structural vulnerability is, and I quote them, a positionality within society that imposes physical and emotional suffering on specific population groups and individuals in patterned ways. And that is a product of class-based economic exploitation and cultural, gender, sexual, and racialized discrimination. And so they have defined a whole number of domains of structural vulnerability, things that put you into a structurally vulnerable position in American society. And here's the list. Your financial status, your legal status, you know, are you documented? Did you come legally or not? Are you naturalized? Your educational level. Can you speak English? Where do you live? Are you in a safe place? Do you have shelter? Are you homeless? What is your food access? Are you food insecure? And something like 20% of American children are food insecure. Do you have a social network? Do you have any social safety net? You know, do you know people who could help you? Is the environment in which you live, does it pose risks to you? Does it pose risks to your health? Does it pose discrimination? And then on this sort of basic level, do you have access to health care? And those who are really writing in this sort of field of structural vulnerability say that, you know, your access to health care, if you're healthy or not, is really a product of your social location. If you are excluded from healthcare services in America, if you don't have basic legal rights to healthcare and you have no money, it is going to affect your health and your well-being. So structural vulnerability really affects your health status. And so I want to argue, and I have in my book, that structural vulnerability is part and parcel of the Iraqi refugee experience in America. They've been resettled in the very country that caused their displacement and suffering, but Iraqi refugees have been very inadequately supported in this resettlement process. And they have really been met with deep suspicion as Muslim others by American society as a whole. And so just briefly here toward the end, I want to talk to you about the Iraqi resettlement challenges. Iraqis in the US face what have been described as 10 major systemic flaws in US refugee resettlement policy. And these have been described very well by the Human Rights Institute of Georgetown University. Include poor planning and coordination. Many states, including Michigan, have received inadequate federal refugee funding, meaning that state agencies are constantly underfunded, with their caseworkers constantly pressured to deliver more and more assistance with limited means. Inadequate cash assistance. This is very interesting. Vietnamese refugees arrived in America in the 1980s, including what were called Vietnamese boat people. They were fed and housed and given up to 36 months, 3 years of cash assistance and other forms of support. And now Vietnamese in America are a model minority community. They're doing better in annual GDP and in higher education than most Americans. They're doing well as a group. Iraqi refugees today, if they're lucky, receive only 8 months of cash assistance. That's the maximum allowable, after which they are left to fend for themselves. And so they are pressured to find immediate employment. And what they face is a lack of sustainable employment opportunities. They're pressured to quickly enter into low-paying jobs, which thrust most refugees into permanent states of chronic poverty and underemployment. They work in McDonald's, they work as janitors, they work in minimum wage positions in America. They often have to work 2 to 3 jobs to sort of scrape together a life. Those who are educated, who were engineers like Sheikh Ali, who were doctors, when they come to America, they've been educated back home and they worked as professionals in their home country. They rarely receive recertification or any kind of vocational training in order to re-enter their fields. And so they don't ever get access again to the professions from which they came. And English language training, many may have some English but not enough, and we call them English as a second language or ESL courses in America. They're often long wait lists to get into ESL courses, and they're often of poor quality. Unreasonable transportation options. Any of you who've traveled to the US, we have very poor public transportation. Same as Beirut, and like a city like Detroit, it's very difficult. It's a wintry, cold environment with inadequate, it has no metros, people can take buses, but in being resettled in a community like Detroit with poor public transportation services makes it difficult to reach job interviews or to reach places of employment. Then inadequate medical care. As with cash assistance, adult refugees are cut off from medical assistance after 8 months. Even though it is estimated that as many as 40% of Iraqi refugees come to the US with pre-existing health conditions. And then inadequate treatment of mental health issues. As many as 75% of Iraqis are thought to suffer from mental health problems, primarily depression and anxiety. And why wouldn't you if you're in this situation? But these go unreported and untreated because the only mandatory mental health assessment occurs at the refugee's initial health screening and never thereafter. Inadequate tracking of secondary migration has proven to be a huge problem for the Iraqi population. Not surprisingly, Iraqi refugees may not like their first initial placement in a state like Montana or Idaho or, whatever, Oklahoma, or Minnesota. And so they choose to relocate. There's been secondary migration to these cluster areas like Arab Detroit. But these secondary migrants become lost in the system with no transfer of their case information from one state agency to another. And so when the US Centers for Disease Control attempted to assess the health and well-being of the Iraqi refugee population through a survey that it conducted in the 3 most populous states of Michigan, California, and Texas, as well as a number of second-tier states like Idaho, one of the major limitations was they couldn't find Iraqis. They had no way of tracing them. They were no longer contactable by state agencies. And then finally, the failure to promote long-term self-sufficiency. Okay, the US Refugee Admissions Program, or USRAP, has a legal obligation, and I quote, to extend protection to the most vulnerable refugees, promote their long-term self-sufficiency, and support their integration. A decade worth of data suggests that US efforts have failed in this regard. They failed miserably, that really the US refugee program is not working in the best interest of Iraqi refugees and has failed to promote their long-term self-sufficiency. Which brings us to the current moment and the current regime. Clearly, America is no longer a welcoming home for Iraqi refugee resettlement, if it ever was, lacking the political will to ensure successful refugee resettlement. America has also entered into an unprecedented period of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment, leading to new regimes of exclusion and persecution. Indeed, in Donald Trump's America, Middle Eastern refugees are vilified, they're being vilified as potential terrorists, even though no act of terrorism has ever been committed by any refugee on US soil. And even though many of the Arab refugees currently living in the US fought valiantly alongside the US military in Iraq. And so, to wit, within days of his inauguration, President Donald Trump kept his campaign pledge by issuing Executive Order 13769, officially titled, this is the title, Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. Executive Order 13769 is more commonly known as the Muslim ban or travel ban. All 7 countries named in the executive order were Muslim countries, mostly in the Middle East, and initially including Iraq. Immediately challenged and blocked by various US courts, the executive order has nonetheless been upheld by the US Supreme Court, which has allowed the Muslim ban to proceed in full, even though the legal challenges against it continue. Meanwhile, President Trump, now President Trump, has decided to dramatically reduce the overall number of refugee admissions to the US to the lowest level since 1980. Even though, and I will say, refugee admissions from 11, they're called high-risk countries, including Syria and Iraq. They have resumed, but at a trickle, with tough new security measures. So, not surprisingly, according to an Oxfam report, the US has taken in less than 10% of its fair share of Syrian refugees, a fraction of the number taken in by this much smaller country of Lebanon. And say what you will, but Lebanon has gone beyond the call of duty to take in vulnerable Syrian refugees, just as it's taken in Palestinians and other refugees from these wars. I know the situation is not perfect here, but it has done so much better than the US in terms of refugee resettlement and or refugee admission. Okay, back to the US. The only silver lining, there's a small silver lining for Middle Eastern refugee resettlement. It has been for Iraqi and Afghan men who served with US forces and are being granted something called SIVs, or Special Immigrant Visas. But for all of the other Iraqis still living in harm's way who want to come into the US but didn't fight or didn't act as interpreters, their future remains very unclear. And it's also unclear for Iraqis who are already in the US but who have yet to be naturalized. We don't know what's going to happen. Are people going to be deported under the Trump regime? And so I want to end with a quote from a very moving article called Michigan's Iraqi Refugee Crisis. And it was written by a journalist named Robert Gooderson, who is a US veteran of the 2003 US war in Iraq. And this is his quote. For the refugee, Iraq will always be home. But knowing he can never return to his native land, he must instead seek refuge in the country whose very military invasion set off the domino effect leading to his displacement. The refugee had the unfortunate luck of living there when the bombs began to fall. Taking in refugees is only half the job. Ensuring they have a fair opportunity to be active participants in the economy is another. An improved refugee program, whether run by the state or the federal government, would be expensive. So is war, though, and a country that starts one should feel the weight of those whose lives are uprooted by it, both its soldiers and the refugees. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions. Please, do you have questions for Professor Inhorn?
Thank you, Marcia. It's really rich. I was thinking that I remember your work on reproductive technologies here in Lebanon, and in comparison, these stories. These stories about infertility in Detroit sound much more tragic. Or at least this is what I hear. So I was wondering what is going. So the stories I remember, at least from the work here in Lebanon, were stories about working together as a couple and hope and what was going on if there's something about American poverty that's really specific, if it's about being a refugee, and versus probably citizens of, or I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, you're right. In my book, The New Arab Man, which is a book, it's really about male infertility in Lebanon and actually Syria Palestinians. Sort of the Levant and the situation of. Yeah, I will say that I heard many war stories from Lebanese men. I mean, and in fact, the same thing. It was about the war and how it affected me and my body and my reproduction. There was a lot of concern about that among men here. So in that way, it was very similar to what these Iraqi guys were sort of worried about as well. And actually, we did all of this sort of assessment of that were Lebanese men carrying heavy metals around in their blood, because that was a concern. And I did this with my colleague at the University of Michigan, just so you know, no, it was actually good. The outcomes were good. Lebanese men weren't they didn't have DU in their blood, for example. But so that theme of like what damage has been done to my body, I lived through the war as a fighter, that was very similar. But I think people here, it's like the war's over, we're done, and we're trying to rebuild our lives. And these were mostly Lebanese couples who were here, in Lebanon, had redeveloped a vibrant IVF sort of sector, and so people had hope that they could overcome their problems. And I told you how expensive it is to do IVF in the U.S. In Lebanon, it's one of the least expensive countries in the world in which to undertake IVF. I mean, I can verify this, having spent some time now with, again, at AUB's IVF center. It's very inexpensive here. You can basically do it for about $1,500 compared to $13,000 or more in the U.S. And so I think that's the despair there. It was like, despair, I'm never going to be able to access this thing which I need. Whereas, and some Lebanese came back to Lebanon from Dearborn to go here because they could access it more affordably. So there was all of that going on. But I have to say, in 2000, this big book came out called Arab Detroit, From Margins to Mainstreams. That was the subtitle. And the book was a very validating kind of book about how the Arab success story in a place like Detroit, Palestinians were doing well, and then the Lebanese came, and it was all about sort of people integrating from the margins and moving into the mainstream, which was good to say that there's a vibrant Arab community in America. And so it was a very positive about food culture and the building of a museum. And it was a rosy book, a thick book. And I started going and working in this reproductive clinic, and it was not the stories that I was seeing. And I realized it was because I was seeing so many Iraqi refugees, and they were not represented in that book. There was one chapter by a woman named Linda Walbridge in that book about Iraqi refugees, and it was similar to what I was seeing. Very despairing, very impoverished, wanting to go back to Iraq, feeling very marginalized, including in the Arab community. And so I think, I was teaching and thinking about this book, Arab Detroit, going, no, I'm not seeing movement to the mainstream. These are still people who are marginalized, and we need to be talking about them too. And sadly, I can tell you, I am one of the few American anthropologists working with Iraqi refugees, who worked with Iraqi refugees. We're going to do we're going to try to get money to do a conference on the anthropological work on Middle Eastern refugees that's being done now. And we're going to do it at Yale in September. And so we sort of scoured the world of like what anthropologists are working on this. Not surprisingly, most are working on Syrian refugees in a variety of places, followed by Afghan refugees, and obviously Palestinian refugees have been worked on quite successfully by anthropologists. There's hardly a person working on the Iraqi refugee story. It's just sort of like an untold story, and it is not. If I told this story to Americans, they go, what? It's just not a story that people in America really think about. Like, oh, do we have Iraqi refugees in America? And like Afghan refugees, I think even less in America. Hardly anybody working on the situation of Afghans. They have not been welcomed into America with open arms. Afghans, even less than Iraqis. So we need more research on this continually vulnerable population. I really want to argue that the reason is they're really marginalized, they're really vulnerable, they're impoverished, we know that, and they're not doing well as a community, and they're not being supported. So I think comparing it to Lebanon, It's a little different. And I did interview a bunch of Lebanese too, mostly Shia Muslim guys and women. And you know, there was more of an extant Lebanese community that was doing well for them to sort of be part of. But for the Iraqi community, it was like starting from scratch, you know. And so I told you the one happy story of this guy named Kamal to show you there were a few couples that had kind of made it a little bit, but that American dream story, that was not the story for most of the Iraqis. They're very tragic stories, yeah.
Hi, I'm a demographer.
And can you wait for the mic? Can we just
Okay.
move the mic around? Thank you so much. Thank you, Rubio.
Hi, I'm a demographer, and one of the ways that they are looking at the Syrian data here in Lebanon is they compare the Syrian refugees to a population called vulnerable Lebanese. And so looking at the socioeconomic status and the aid provided. So for example, some of the vulnerable Lebanese communities don't get the social safety net, if you would call it that, of some of the aid that's given just to refugee populations. So I was wondering in the US context, because I am American, but I know we have Medicaid and other kinds of a social safety net. For Americans, are they people of the same socioeconomic status, whether they're the Iraqi refugees or the Americans of the same economic, I would say, resource level? Are they able to get the same services, or do you feel that there's another parallel system being born for the refugees?
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, and I really what I'm trying to do is to do exactly what you're talking about. I'm trying to compare one vulnerable population with the vulnerable population sitting next to it, which is the Black, you know, low-income population in America. And actually the refugee resettlement program was modeled on U.S. welfare, on the U.S. welfare program. You know, things like WIC and, you know, aid to dependent families. And actually there's a belief that, you know, the welfare sort of is delivered especially to women with children. It ignores men, and it actually splits up families. We know that from studying, you know, Black communities. It's really to try to support single moms and kids, and we see some of that happening now in the Iraqi refugee population. The notion of like being put on welfare, you know, that this is a way to sort of support yourself. But the people I was interviewing, nobody was on welfare as far as I know. They were all like trying to work. They were very underemployed. They were trying to work. And most of them did not have health insurance. You know, they weren't accessing Medicaid, you know. And we just really don't know. I mean, this one CDC study really spoke to how we just don't know what's going on with this population. In some senses, they're being kind of lost in the system. And so they're not like sort of being tracked in the way that, you know, populations on welfare are. I mean, one could argue that being put on welfare would actually help some of these people because they're struggling so much. But you know, I don't know, and I haven't seen any, you know, I haven't seen any research on it either. The most recent, you know, study was this big CDC study showing high levels of chronic health problems in this population and high levels of unemployment, you know, just people not employed at all. It was a very sobering overview of this population. Yeah, so unfortunate. Yeah.
Marcia, I'm really puzzled by the issue of those Iraqi refugees getting to America. It's not easy to find refuge in America. And it's certainly less easy than getting into Europe, either legally or illegally. They have an option to go through. And I know that within North America, for example, those who made it to Canada were taken in through circuits that started in the first refuge home, and continued when they ended up in Montreal and Toronto. There were networks taking care of how to insert them in a modest way in life. Where did the circuit start, and where did they fail, those specific Iraqi refugees?
Yeah, so these Iraqis, the statistics I showed you, these are ones who officially came as official U.S. refugees. And they mostly came from camps in Jordan, you know, that they started there, and it took years for many of these. And actually the first Gulf War Iraqi refugees from the first Gulf War, they were encamped in Saudi Arabia. It was a horrible situation along the border with Iraq. They mostly came out of Saudi Arabia, but these were encamped. These were encamped Iraqi refugees who applied for refugee resettlement in the U.S. It took years, but eventually what happened is they weren't letting any Iraqis in for about the first 4 years of the war, And then, you know, human rights organizations, and actually he was like the US ambassador, basically played on the conscience of George W. Bush, who was still president, and said, you cannot have done this without, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are stuck now in Jordan, we need to do something. And so there was a change in policy in 2007, and that, you know, and so in 2008, all of these refugees started coming in, and they are official US refugees, okay? But what's happened now, since President Trump, is that has stopped, and the only ones getting in are these special priority. And even when the Muslim ban was initiated, you know, some of these Iraqi interpreters who had been waiting for years to get in with their families were turned back at JFK Airport. It was a horrible stain on, you know, America. But so I'm only talking about official U.S. rock, and ones who are trying to come in through other ways or through, you know.
And once the disembarked, there was nothing waiting for them?
Very little. I mean, very little. No, to come into the U.S., there are certain things that if you are a resettled Iraqi refugee, that must be given to you. You know, you must have a shelter on your first night in America. You must have a home-cooked meal like you would have in your home country. I don't know who came up with that policy. How many you may know. I don't. Yeah, you know. So culturally appropriate meal, you know. Right, and I should tell you that a lot of the agencies who've helped in the resettlement, it wasn't just official refugee resettlement programs, like we have one in New Haven called IRIS, Integrated Refugee Immigrant Services, IRIS, and in Dearborn, they have a huge one called Access, Arab Community Center. So there are these refugee resettlement agencies, and it's their responsibility, it devolves onto them to do that, to find the shelter. But the problem is they're cut off so quickly, you know, and with this huge influx of Iraqis, they literally were overwhelmed in Michigan with people coming in, and then people kind of get lost. The caseworkers can't handle, you know, the number of cases and so forth. And so, you know, there was minimum assistance provided, but the argument is there's not nearly enough to, you know, really make a life for people in America. There's one anthropologist who's looking at the Iraqi Chaldean refugee population, the Iraqi Christians who've come in recent years, and because they're sort of seen as not being sort of on the right side of the Iraqi refugee situation, they're having a very hard time as a sort of very vulnerable population of Iraqi refugees. They're mostly in California. And you know, where are Iraqis being placed in California? If anybody knows the geography of California, there's this interior section near San Bernardino. It's the desert, it's called the Inland Empire. It's almost all Latino. It's Latino, poor farm workers and people who sort of settled in the Central Valley of California. And so that's where they put Iraqis. And so Iraqis are coming into this, you know, very Latino kind of landscape and trying to sort of make their way in this landscape in the Central Valley, which is agricultural, and it's a very polluted part of America because of agricultural pollution. They're not put into good areas, you know, they're not put into sort of safe places. And even New Haven, I mean, let's face it, if you know New Haven at all, Yale University is a bubble. It is a rich bubble in a sea of destitution. New Haven is one of the poorest communities, definitely in the state of Connecticut and actually in America. It is basically a black city of people who were disenfranchised when all the factory jobs left. And it is a poor community, mostly black, and now it's got a growing Latino and Arab and Afghan refugee population. It's a safe haven city. It's considered to be a haven city for undocumented people, but it's a poor city, you know. So refugees often end up in these places that really can't afford to sustain them well. And so how are they ever going to be long-term, permanently, you know, integrated into the population? Now, having said that, it's not all bleak, because at our Council on Middle East Studies at Yale, we've hired, in the last 10 years that I've been there, two of the most wonderful people, Amar and Marwa. They're both Iraqi refugees. We hired them because they came through IRIS, and they've done really well. They've bought homes, they're doing really well, they've had children, they speak English beautifully. But they were assisted, and one other thing I want to tell you about assistance beyond the resettlement agencies. Does anybody know who's doing the other kind of assistance for refugees in America?
Churches?
It's faith-based organizations. It's churches like the Lutheran Church, Catholic Social Services, the Unitarian Church, synagogues. It's religious communities who've done a lot to get furniture and clothing and to sort of help people in their adjustment. So that's the story of American refugee resettlement. But compared to Vietnamese refugees, who were the other big group that came in because of a US war, America has done relatively little for the refugees from the wars that it's caused, especially Iraqis and Afghans.
Any more questions?
Thank you. Did any one of them return to Iraq?
In my group, not that I know of, but there was, because in 2008, when the economy tanked in Michigan, you know that Barack Obama had to bail out the auto industry. That was in Detroit, Michigan. I mean, that's where, when I was doing this work, the economy was beginning to just slide downward in Michigan. And the city of Detroit, I didn't mention this, in 2013, it was the largest municipal bankruptcy in America. The city of Detroit had to declare bankruptcy. It was so impoverished. And so there were unemployed, the rates of Iraqi unemployment were something like 25%. They were 3 times higher than the other populations. And so there were reports that Iraqis were just saying, to hell with it, I'm going back to Iraq. I really can't make it in this country. So there have been reports of that. You can find reports of that, but I personally don't know anybody. And I'm in touch with my friends who are Iraqi refugees, and many of them will not go back to Iraq. Even if they could, they will not go back. They said it's a very dangerous, still very unsettled situation. A lot of their families have since then left, like elderly parents have gone to Turkey or have gotten out and live outside, so like our Amar, who we know very well, he eventually got most of his natal family out of the country. One by one, he brought his mother and his younger brother, and his wife's family and her brother, and they're basically all out of Iraq now, and they say they have no intention of going back because it's really been a very dangerous, very ongoing dangerous situation in Iraq. Yeah.
I think this will be our final question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I just want to say, we are still dealing or addressing the problems or the symptoms of this migration and so on. Don't you think it's high time to address the causes of why people are becoming refugees? Yeah, countries seem to be very shy or don't want to go deeper and see what are the causes behind for those people forcing them that they are forced to leave their countries. And among your list of structural vulnerability, I did not see religion. Don't you think religion is also one of those structural challenges?
Well, I put it in my list of what I call the intersection of oppressions. Yeah, but that list of structural vulnerabilities is coming out of the medical anthropological work of Philippe Bourgois and others who know they don't include religion, and they mostly work with homeless people, with Latinos. And I think it should be. I think religion is very, very important, and I think for Muslims it is a form of vulnerability to be openly identified as Muslim in America. You can be killed for that. We know you can be killed for that in New Zealand. Yeah, it makes you vulnerable in America. There's a lot of good work on sort of the discrimination against Muslims. One of our colleagues at Yale, Zarina Grewal, has an excellent book called Islam as a Foreign Country, and it's really about sort of how Islam's got a long history in America, including with black. It really was initially a black religion in America, African Americans, but then with migrants coming in, and really the kind of profiling and targeting of Muslims in America. So that is covered. Going back to your first point, so I agree with you, religion is very important. Going back to your first point, my whole book, I think, and the point of this talk is to say, yeah, we need to look at the root cause, which is the damn war and the political violence, and America caused a lot of the problem. I mean, I know you here in Lebanon know that. America has been involved in every bloody conflict, including in Lebanon. Marines were killed in barracks here because they were here in Lebanon during the Civil War. And it goes back even further in Lebanon, American involvement. America gets involved in so many conflicts. And it continues to be. And what really bothers me in America is the memory loss. Like, as if we've had nothing to do with it. You would never talk about these wars unless you were a military family. And the military families, who are they in America? They tend to be marginalized, vulnerable people who are joining the military because they don't have a lot of other options. And so people from America who go to fight these wars are often Latinos and African Americans, people who don't have other routes into integration. So war is something like over here for those kind of people in America, military families. But in general, mainstream thinking in America, we just aren't talking about war. There's very little anti-war rhetoric at all, is there? All the rhetoric now is what I talked about at the end. Keep Muslims out of the country, keep immigrants out, we need to have a border wall. It's a horrible nationalist, fascist, right-wing rhetoric coming right out of the Oval Office. It's so loud. It's on Fox News 24/7, and that is the rhetoric that we're hearing every day in America. And it's making things even worse for an already vulnerable population. And so I care about this, Kaveh cares about this, a lot of people, progressive people care about this, but it just isn't, most Americans would have probably great disagreements with what I just told you, it wouldn't be a popular thing that I just said to parts of America. I am going on April 3rd to the Branford, Connecticut Rotary to give a shortened version of this talk, and we'll see what they say. I think Americans need to think about their, and I also think Americans, this is another thought that I have, I think that the reason why Americans have forgotten all of this stuff about the wars and so forth is because we no longer have a draft. Young Americans are young Americans no longer risk going to war, and so no one's worried about their son.
It's not Vietnam.
It's not Vietnam anymore. That's when you saw the anti-war activism was during Vietnam, but now it was only the poor and marginalized kids from rural Texas who end up in the military, and their families are the ones who pay the price. So that's what I think is really going on. Americans don't care unless their kids are being drafted into these things. It's a very cynical view, but I really do believe that. And I've given this talk in front of people in ROTC. Yale brought back its ROTC, its military training, so that Yale students can be part of the Army, the Marines, the Navy. And sad to say, this is another thing about Yale, sad to say, the greatest interest in learning Arabic among young people at Yale University is the kids in ROTC. They're learning the language so that they can come to this part of the world as military figures. Okay, so enough said. It was bleak, I'm sorry.
One quick announcement before we go. Thank you again so much, Marcia. It was really quite extraordinary. I just want to remind you that, among other things, tomorrow there's a conference on another American intervention, 1958, which will be over at the Sun Ferris, and we'll be inaugurating our Policy and Politics in America's series of lectures with Salim Yaqub's keynote address there. So if you're interested in what was a watershed year, 1958 here, and the relationship with the U.S., please attend that.
What time is that, Robert? Just
it's at 5 o'clock tomorrow at the Sun Ferris Institute, and thank you all for coming. And
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marcia.